And you're good? Okay. The prayers of our Holy Fathers, Lord Jesus Christ, our God, have mercy on us and save us. Amen. We just had an entire liturgy, and I don't need to add anything to that. We've said it all tonight already. So thank you all for sticking around, and blessed Lent to you all. Carisado Christi. Let's review a little bit about where we've been so that we can talk about where we are tonight, okay? So we spoke. Oh, is the battery dead on this? Battery's dead on this. I don't know, maybe it's not. We started out and we talked about God's creation of man in his image with the goal and the mission to go and to spread his presence and be his presence in the entire world. We know that Adam and Eve sinned, they fell, they did not fulfill that responsibility, and they spread instead sin and corruption throughout the entire world as their children and offspring continued to expand. God had to launch a rescue plan, and so the first start was to recreate the earth through the flood, to wipe it clean of the taint of corruption and sin that Adam and Eve and their offspring had spread. He then made a new covenant with Noah and promised that he would never again flood the earth in that way, and made a cosmic covenant with him. We then looked at the way that God established a new covenant with Abraham, that now established who the people of God would be. He established what the place of God would be, or where he would dwell with them, but he had not yet reestablished any presence with them. Right? We talk about the people of God and the place of God and the presence of God. The presence was not yet established. With Moses, the people of God are there. They're marching towards the place, towards Canaan, and he reestablishes his presence, but only on an intermediate or periodic basis, and only really in the presence of the high priest, and that but once a year, right? As we hear about in Hebrews. Well, Moses ends up dying just in view of the promised land, but not able to enter it because of his doubting God in the wilderness and the grumbling of the people. That generation did not enter into the promised land except for two people. Who were the two people that were in the Exodus that were allowed to enter the promised land?
Joshua was one.
Joshua, and who's the other? His assistant, his right-hand man.
Aaron.
Caleb. By the way, Joshua in the Septuagint, remember, is Jesus, right? Jesus. And there's a very clear connection that's being made there, right? Joshua leads the people into Canaan. They conquer the people that were there. They establish their presence in Canaan. And as we'll talk about, they spread out, and problems began almost immediately. Okay, let's orient ourselves though a little bit in time and place. We talked about the Exodus being somewhere in that 1446 time period or 1275 time period, depending on which numbering you're using, right? Whether we're using, we're taking Solomon's chronology that he establishes in the Book of Kings as being factual rather than symbolic, then it puts you at 1446. If you understand it more in terms of symbolism and look at extrinsic archaeology, it's probably more like 1275. Joshua and the conquest is about 40 years after that, right? Just a little bit more. We have the era of the judges that lasts for a period of a few hundred years. And we get to David. And David, we've got pretty solid dating. When we get to Saul, David, and Solomon, we've got solid dating there. The biblical number and chronology and the archaeology all match up. And you're talking right around the year 1050 BC and continuing. So that's about the time period that we're talking about, right? About 1000 BC. We, of course, know the place that we've been talking about, Canaan, all this time, also known as Israel, also known as Palestine. And we won't get into it very much right now, but there is a very definite plan as to why Joshua is conquering whom he's conquering when he conquers Canaan with the people of God. And we'll talk about that when we start moving through book by book in the Old Testament. We'll focus a little bit more on what's going on with Joshua. But as soon as Joshua then dies, the ruling, or the rulership, so to speak, of the promised land, of the peoples in the promised land, the people of God in the promised land, falls to a series of judges, right? We read about this in the book of Judges. This shows how the different tribes split up the land of Canaan. And you'll notice, in addition to the various 12 tribes, there are some names that we'll hear at various times in the Bible: the Ammonites and the Moabites, who are living not too far away. This line here becomes important later. This will be the dividing line between the northern tribes and the southern tribes as we get into the time after Solomon. But we see here, this is the land of Judah, which includes the town of Bethlehem. And we have the tribe of Benjamin, which is a small tribe, a much smaller tribe. Incidentally, it's the tribe that St. Paul would come from. And that included the area around the city of Jerusalem. Okay. The other major town that's important is Shiloh, because when they come into Canaan, when they bring the tabernacle, they bring the tent of meeting, they will establish it in Shiloh. And that is where the tent of meeting will be until David will bring it into Jerusalem when he becomes king. Okay. But for now, Shiloh is actually the focus of all of their worship. 3 times a year, they will come there. Now, this era of the judges, well, let me back up. One thing that you should notice about this, it's all divided up in these various tribes. This was not really a nation in terms of how it functioned. It was a confederation of tribes. Okay? These were various tribes with different tribal chieftains and various elders within each tribe. And the tribes functioned very much separate from each other. They functioned kind of on their own. And the only time they really ever interacted with each other were 3 times a year on the major feasts, when they would come to Shiloh and gather at the tent of meeting for worship. And that was about the only time that they really interacted and came into any kind of contact with each other. Otherwise, they stayed in their own tribal lands. You were only allowed to marry within your tribe. Your property had to stay within the tribe. It was very much focused on each other, and everybody was kind of doing their own thing. And what happens in the book of Judges is very quickly a pattern begins to establish. The people of God obey the covenant, then they disobey the covenant. That leads to foreign oppression, which then leads to repentance and a cry for deliverance. God raises up a deliverer or a judge who fights off the foreign oppression, people like Gideon and Deborah and some of these others. They have a military victory, and so the people all start obeying God in the covenant, and then they disobey the covenant, and then foreign oppression, and the cycle starts over and over again. There's a cycle of 12 judges in the book of Judges, 12 being a pretty symbolic number, right? And what becomes very clear is that it's degenerating. It's getting worse and worse and worse with each one. Some of these stories that are very vivid for us, that we all know and we learned in Sunday school and things like Samson. Samson's not a hero in Judges. He's a very disobedient guy. He's not obeying God, right? He's not cast as a hero at all. Quite the opposite, right? And yet he's the judge who's supposed to try and throw off the shackles of foreign oppression, and he doesn't get very far because he's too sinful, right? In the end, towards the end of the book, it says, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Right? It's every man, woman, and child for themselves. They do their own thing. And they're not really following the covenant. In fact, it's gotten so bad, we hear a story at the end of Judges about a man who takes his concubine to another city. And the men of the city come to him. It's like Sodom and Gomorrah. And this mob demands, send the visiting man out so that we can have relations with him, as if he were a woman. And they're demanding, send the man out. And the man says, no. And he says, you know what? Have my concubine instead. And he sends his concubine out. They rape and abuse her overnight. The entire mob does. And in the morning, the man opens up the door and finds his concubine dying on his doorstep. He then cuts her up and sends her to the 12 tribes of Israel, pieces of it, and says, this is the horror of the land of Israel. This is how bad things have gotten in Israel. It's a horrific, horrific scene, right? And this is why God is allowing foreign oppression to continue to occur in the land, right? And they begin to cry out. But God never abandons his people completely, even despite their sinfulness. And he raises up a righteous woman named Hannah, who goes and prays in the temple. She's barren, and she prays for a child. And says, Lord, I will dedicate my child to you if you will give me a child. Okay. She prays. God hears the prayer. The priest blesses her, hears her prayer, and she has a child named Samuel. And there's this beautiful hymn that she sings. This is in the beginning of First Kingdoms, or First Samuel, the book. And what you'll notice is that when the Virgin Mary, when the Panayia, sings her hymn, my soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior, right? She's very purposefully using words that are echoing Hannah's hymn when she gave birth to the prophet Samuel. Okay? Her prayer is a very Jewish prayer. It's a very biblical prayer. And it's, Samuel comes as sort of a deliverer at a time when Israel needs it desperately. And in that sense, he's a type or a figure of the Christ who would come. And so her hymn matches that of Hannah in many ways. And she follows through on her promise. She gives birth to Samuel, and when he's a young child, she takes him to the temple and leaves him there. And when you really think about it, right, a lot of us, we have trouble with a little child leaving them at daycare, right? And she takes Samuel to the temple and leaves him there to be raised by the priest. And the thing to notice here is that he is a prophet, right? We know that, and he's prophesied to be a prophet, and he functions as a prophet. He also, though, lives in the temple, is raised by the priests, and ends up essentially functioning as a priest. He wasn't actually of a priestly line, and yet he functions as a priest, having been raised by the priests in the temple. And in fact, many of the iconography you'll see, he holds the symbols of priesthood, including a censer. So he's functioning as a priest. He is a prophet, and he's the last of the judges of Israel. And so he's already exercising those three offices of priest, prophet, essentially king. He's the one who anoints the kings and rules Israel. So he's already exercising as this type or foreshadowing of Christ. The thing that I would just mention, there is a wonderful book by Metropolitan Herotheos of Naupactos called The Seer, The Life and Relevance of the prophet Samuel Today. It's an excellent book commenting on his life and his ministry and the biblical commentary. I don't have time to get into all of it right now, but if you're more interested in this story, and it touches on then, of course, David and Saul and so on, this is an excellent book to pick up. So, nevertheless, despite having this righteous prophet as the judge of Israel finally, it says, nevertheless, the people ask for a king, that we also may be like all the nations, that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. Now, if you recall, last time we talked about the fact that in Deuteronomy, God had promised Israel that when you go into the promised land, I will raise up a king for you. Well, of his choosing, he says, right? I will choose who the king will be and raise it up for you. Now, as soon as they got into the promised land, like you said, they immediately start disobeying the covenant, right? And then they start demanding, we want a king, right? And we want it not so that he can lead us in worshiping you, not so that he can lead us in covenant faithfulness to you, but rather so that he can go fight our battles, right? So that we can be like the other nations around us. He can be like a king just like all the other kings. That's the kind of king we want. God, we want you to give us that kind of king now at our timeline, right? Now, eventually, God says, okay, he relents, right? And we'll talk what did I do with it? Here we go. I'm sorry. I was going to point out, right? It's a tale of two kings, because with Saul, the Lord says to Samuel, do as they say and install a king over them. The Hebrew actually could also read for them. In other words, give them the king they want. Right? God says, fine, you want a king so bad, you can have the king you want. Right? As opposed to when he chooses David, I'm sending you to Jesse in Bethlehem, for I have selected a king for myself from among his sons. Right? Saul is the king the people chose. David is the king that God will choose. And we'll see why. Because Saul, it says, was a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish. By the way, Benjamin, what did we say? Small tribe in the middle of nowhere. Is politically insignificant. It's small, it's weak, it's not as powerful. So we'll appoint a king from one of the weak tribes so that his tribe can't just take over, right? He had a son whose name was Saul, a handsome young man. There was not a man among the people of Israel more handsome than he. From his shoulders upward, he was taller than any of the people. So he's tall, he's strong, he's good looking, he's politically neutral, he's part of a small tribe that isn't going to take over. He is the perfect choice to be king. This is the king they want. Right? The problem is, what we're going to find very quickly is that he's also emotionally troubled. He's insecure. His insecurities start to get the best of him. He starts to make poor decisions that are not the decisions that God asked him to do. He starts engaging in witchcraft. He's doing all of these things because he's so insecure and mentally unstable, right? He gets so angry, he throws a spear at David at one point. David has to sing songs for him, right? Saul's not a good choice. But God was saying, look, if that's what you want, have your king. Right? God doesn't force us in the end. So, during that time, the kingdom of Israel is united. And the reality is the kingdom of Israel, we think of the kingdom of Israel, it was only united for a very short period of time. It was united for the kingships of Saul, David, and Solomon. That's it. 3 kings. And by the time Solomon's dead, there's already a civil war raging, and they split forever. Okay? So when we think of the kingdom of Israel and this united kingdom, it doesn't last very long. We'll talk a little bit about why. All right. So, even as Saul is ruling, God tells Samuel, go anoint David, the king that I'm choosing. And remember, it's a totally different scenario. He's not the tallest, he's not the strongest, he's not the most handsome. Instead, he goes to Jesse's household, and he goes through and he sees all of these strapping young men. And he says, oh, it must be one of these. God, show me which one. And God says, no, it's not any of them. And he gets to the end of the sons, and God says, it's none of them. And he says to Jesse, did I miss anybody? And he says, well, my youngest, the little kid's out in the field. He says, go call him. And he brings David in. God says, anoint him. He's the king. He's the small, scrawny kid who's been out in the field, right? He's probably dirty. He probably smelled bad. This picture is far too nice to him. He was a shepherd living in the fields, right? He was filthy, probably wearing rags, and he's anointed as the next king of Israel. David, in fact, was called really 3 times. That first time when he's anointed in Jesse's home. The second, God calls him and inspires him as he's playing music in Saul's court to soothe Saul's troubled soul. It's emphasizing that David is a musician and a liturgist, right? And why is that? Because where's the only other place we're going to hear about David? It's in the Psalms, right? He's a psalmist. And so they're emphasizing this point, that he's a musician and a liturgist from very early on in his life. And then finally, when he defeats Goliath. Now, I purposefully chose a cartoon version of this that makes Goliath look absolutely huge, because it's actually not the case. The Hebrew text seems to be a little bit newer, right? The Septuagint Greek text that we have is actually older than the Hebrew text that we have for this. In the Septuagint, he's described as only being about 6'6". Okay, he's big, but he's not unnatural. Because what did we talk about a few sessions ago? What's a giant in the Old Testament? It's not a physically huge person. It is a person who is the offspring of certain pagan, demonic, cultic worship, right? He's the offspring of certain types of pagan ritual sexual practices and is essentially demon-possessed. I mean, that's what the Bible is trying to get across there. He was clearly big, he was large, right? But it's not trying to convey that he's some unnatural different species that's 9.5 feet tall and makes Andre the Giant look small, right? By the way, one of the interesting things to note, where else in the ancient world do we hear of two armies facing off and they both send out a champion to fight and allow the gods to decide based on who wins between the two champions, and that sort of determines the outcome of the battle? It's in ancient Greece. Troy. Why? The Philistines were Greek. They were the sea people. They were, as the Mycenaean culture collapsed, the Mycenaean Greeks took to the sea and landed in part in Palestine, which is corruption, right? Philistine, right? There's a similar root there. The Philistines were the Mycenaean Greeks who had fled during the collapse of that culture. And so that's why you see some similar fighting techniques there to what we read about in Homer. Right? Incidentally, the other thing, why do they make such a point of Goliath wearing all that armor? To the point where they're describing it using words that show up in Hebrew only in that narrative. It's the only place they talk about it, because the Hebrews didn't even have words for some of these pieces of armor. This is the dawn of the Iron Age. They're just discovering iron, right? And Goliath has all this iron armor, right? He's not only big and strong, he's not only a skilled fighter, he's not only demon-possessed, he's also got the most effective and advanced war technology of his age, right? And that's what they're trying to convey here, is that the odds are impossible, right? Yeah?
He's kind of the Mandalorian of his day.
Exactly, he's the Mandalorian. Yeah, exactly. He's got the best armor, right? It's the Beskar of Canaan, exactly. And so, yeah, to send a little kid out there who was too small to even fit Saul's armor on him, the odds are pretty well stacked. He doesn't need to be 9.5 feet tall to make the point. Right? Anyway, but God watches over his anointed and allows him ultimately to rule. Right? And when David has finally taken his throne, right, there's been a civil war. He's been fighting with Saul, the forces loyal to Saul. There's a civil war, and ultimately he takes his throne. And it says that when the king lived in his house, and the Lord had given him rest from all his surrounding enemies. Right? Notice what had God said in Deuteronomy is when you go into the land of Canaan, when you go into the promised land and take up your rest, I will give you a king. And when David takes his throne, it says that God gave him rest from his enemies. It's echoing that language from Deuteronomy. Now, David immediately says, all right, Lord, I'm here, and I've built a great house for myself. I've built this great palace. I'm in this great house, and it's time for me to build you a house. And so I'm ready to build a house for you. I'm going to build a temple, and he's got all these plans of how he's going to build this great temple. And he tells his prophet Nathan, and Nathan comes back and said, By the way, why would a king build a temple in the ancient world? It was to keep the God who put him on the throne happy. And the problem is David immediately takes up his throne and says, I'm going to build a temple. And God says, I didn't ask for a temple. You're not one of those kings, and I'm not one of those gods. I didn't ask you to build me a temple. But David really wanted to build a temple. So, God tells Nathan, ultimately the prophet, to go back and tell David, I don't want a temple, right? And there's this whole dialogue going back and forth. Instead, God says, by the way, there's 3 ways that the word house gets used in that time. For an actual dwelling, including a palace. For a temple, a house of God. And a dynasty. Right? All 3 can be used in the same way. We still say that, right? The house of whoever, right? And there's that wordplay is going on here, right? He's saying, you gave me a house and I want to give you a house. And God says, I want to give you a true house, meaning I want to give you a dynasty, right? He says, when your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. When he commits iniquity, I will discipline him with the rod of men, with the stripes of the sons of men, but my steadfast love will not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away from before you. And your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Right? That's that word house. Your throne shall be established forever. Now, obviously, to some extent, he's talking about Solomon, but not really. Right? Who's he talking about? But it's Christ.
Christ.
Right? He's talking about Christ. And what is the house that will be built? I'm going to urge you, pay attention to the salutations on Friday night. Who is the house of the Lord? For the Virgin Mary's womb. Well, in the church in a sense, but it becomes the Virgin Mary's womb, right? She is the descendant who is, in fact, the house, and we will call her that in the salutation service in the Akathist and the canon.
Is she called the throne sometimes?
She's the throne. Yeah, she's called the throne, absolutely. And many other things. The curdled mountain, right? That's referred to in the Psalms. And basically, what I would suggest is when you come to the salutation services in the Akathist, bring with you your entire Old Testament thesaurus, dictionary, Strong's Concordance, whatever it is. You are going to hear so many references to the Old Testament flying at you. Every line is a new reference to a new verse in the Old Testament. That every single time you hear it and see it and read it, you're going to go, oh, that's Habakkuk, right? Or that's from Joshua. They're going to call her Gideon's fleece, right? They're going to call her the bush that burned but was not consumed. It's going to call her all sorts of Old Testament references. Yeah. But in particular, she becomes the throne, she's the temple, she's the palace, she's the house, right? Of course, Solomon builds a temple, but it's not really the temple that God wants. Right? And what you'll see is that even his prayer to God to fill the temple and consecrate it with his presence takes on a very different format than the prayers of Moses when God came down onto the tabernacle. It takes on, there's a little bit of a pagan flavor to it. He wants the temple established so that they can come there and God will then do what he wants God to do for them. And he's kind of bargaining with God in the course of consecrating the temple. Why is this? Because as we know, Solomon is not very faithful, right? Almost immediately, he's already sliding into paganism. He had, I don't even memorize the number, but it's some hundreds and hundreds of wives and concubines that he's got of every single possible stripe of paganism. And he establishes all sorts of different tribes, right? Because he builds a temple for Yahweh. And immediately he's starting to build temples and shrines and high places and so on for all of the other gods and goddesses of all of his many wives, right? He's already sliding into paganism. He's not being faithful to the covenant. And it becomes a real problem, right? And almost immediately the kingdom ends up being divided. And we see as soon as we get to Solomon's sons, it divides into the southern kingdoms, which is Judah, and the northern kingdom, which is Israel. Jerusalem remains the center of worship in the temple for those in Judah, but for those in Israel, they establish two additional shrines, one in Bethel and one in Dan. Notice, and I haven't really traced this all out exactly how this happens, but if you'll notice in the earlier, when I showed you where the various tribes were, notice where Dan's tribe is. It's supposed to be down here by Benjamin, right? And then it has this little bit up here. They essentially all get sort of isolated up there, right? Because Dan immediately starts going pagan as well. And so by the time we get into the northern and southern kingdom, we have two additional sites in Dan and in Bethel, where they right away put up golden calves and other pagan statues and idols for worship there, despite the temple still being in Jerusalem. So they're already going completely pagan at that point. We'll talk a little bit about what happens in terms of the interim then, after the kingdom splits, how they go into exile and come back a little bit in the next session when we start talking about the prophecies leading to Christ. I want to point out one other, by the way, in the icon of the resurrection and the descent into Hades, we see two kings there. Who are the two kings? They're the only two righteous kings in the entire Old Testament.
David and...
David?
Is it Asa?
Hezekiah repented for a little while, but didn't last. Josiah. It's Josiah. So David and Josiah are the only two righteous kings of Israel. And David in particular is always depicted as an old man because he had to repent, right? He fell. He didn't always do very well, but he did repent. He repented heartily. So yeah, this dynasty didn't go very well, right? I want to move to one other smaller topic that's actually really important, and then we'll wrap up because I know it's getting late for everybody. Does anyone have questions on what we've covered so far? What we see here is God establishing with David a true covenant for a king that will last forever, right? A king that will last forever on his throne, but that he will also establish a house, which has the idea of the temple, right?
I do have one
Yeah.
question. With the kings, all the ones were considered evil, right?
Right, we hear that refrain, right? And they did what was evil in the sight of God.
Right,
And they went to
right.
rest with their fathers, and the rest of their deeds were written down. Move on to the next.
My question is most of them would just come down, they might do everything God wanted, but the Asherah poles would be a snag.
That's right. Exactly.
What was an Asherah pole?
They were cultic poles. They were, she was a goddess, I believe, in one of the Canaanite religions. Associated in some way or another with Baal, one of the other Canaanite gods, and I think she was associated in particular with fertility rites, and in particular with cultic orgies.
Okay,
So they thought worshiping her was pretty fun, and it was a way to establish, their crops and their children. And so they would keep worshiping her, and every time God would tell the king, tear it down, right? Knock it off. And he'd say, well, I'm going to do some good things, but I'm not going to stop that. And, the pattern of sin continued. And, I do think that there is a lesson there for us in some respects because, like it says in Proverbs, God says, son, give me your heart. And I think there is a lesson there for, we say we worship God, but do we leave some high places to false gods still in our heart, right, and in our lives? Do we make excuses and refuse to give him the entirety of our heart and our worship and our trust? Yeah.
What was that? I know there were golden calves that they had at Bethel and Dan. Like, what was the plan there, and how is that differentiated in any way from like your local Asherah pole, Baal altar, Molech worship center, or were they purporting to be doing something?
I think so. I mean, they said they were worshiping Yahweh,
Okay.
right? But they're using the imagery and the cultic practices of the Canaanites around them. And I'm not clear enough on the specifics of that. But if you read it, they say they're worshiping Yahweh, right? And you see that, especially like with Elijah, who's operating in the northern kingdom and goes to some of these places and prophesies against them. You know, they said they're worshiping Yahweh, but they're not,
Okay.
right?
So
And
some
they're-
sort of weird blendy thing.
That's exactly it. It's all syncretistic, right? It's, I mean, in a sense, kind of like the first time we hear about a golden calf, right? They say they're worshiping Yahweh. They say they're going to make a body for Yahweh, but it's a golden calf, right? It's a pagan Egyptian symbol. So yeah, that's, you know, they're blending and kind of hedging their bets, right? And doing it in a place where God told them, I don't want to be worshipped there. I want to be worshipped with my temple, with the Ark of the Covenant in Jerusalem. So, yeah. Other questions on this before I move on? Okay. So I want to point out one thing because it's important to us, and it gets into, I was talking actually with Ray a little bit before we started about the icon screen and some of the icons that were on there, and it just so happens that it's a little bit of our topic tonight. In 3 Kingdoms, or 1 Kings 2:19, it talks about Solomon, and it says Bathsheba, remember his wife, his mother, the former wife of Uriah. Uzziah, right?
Uriah, you were right.
Uriah, okay. So Bathsheba went to King Solomon to speak to him on behalf of Adonijah. And the king rose to meet her and bowed down to her. Then he sat on his throne and had a seat brought for the king's mother, and she sat on his right. So Solomon takes up his royal court to, hear whatever he needs to hear, make whatever decisions he needs to make. And what does he do? He makes sure that he sits down a throne right next to him and has his mother, the queen mother, sit in that throne next to him. This was a particular feature, it would go on to be a particular feature of the kings of Judah in particular. We read in Psalm 44, the queen stands at your right hand clothed in gold, right? So already David is writing about this in the Psalms. And when we get into 1st and 2nd Kings, every time that it mentions who the king of Judah was, it mentions who his mother was. As part of the official recording of who he was and what his reign was, it specifically identifies who his mother was. Now you could say, well, that's just because it was polygamous, right? Kings had a lot of wives back then, and so you want to record which queen did he come from, right? But they don't record who the mother of the Israelite kings were. The kings of the kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom, it doesn't record who their mothers were, but it does for Judah. And Israel was no less polygamous than Judah. It's a particular feature that the queen mother in Judah, in the kingdom of Judah, reigned with her son, right? She sat as part of that divine court, that divine council, or not divine, I'm sorry, kingly court and kingly council, right? Well, when Christ comes, and by the way, in this, right, she goes to speak to him on behalf of Adonijah. She goes to speak. Somebody has a problem, they don't go to Solomon, right? They go to Bathsheba and say, talk to your son and have him do what I need done for me. Now, it doesn't go so well for Adonijah here, right? But the same thing occurs where?
Cana.
At Cana, in the wedding feast, right? And sure enough, in all of our iconography, who stands at the right hand of Christ? The Queen Mother. And in all of her clothing, she'll have gold fringe, right? At his right hand stands the Queen clothed in gold. And that's why on the icon screen, to the immediate right of Christ, what's always to the immediate right of Christ? The Virgin Mary, right? The Queen Mother sitting at his right hand. Who else stood in the kingly court? We've talked about a couple of them today already. Samuel and Nathan, and we'll read about more of them as time goes on, right? It was the prophet. The two primary figures, in addition to the king of Judah, in his court, in his kingly court, was the Queen Mother and the prophet of God. And what do we see in our icons? Because who's to the left of Christ always? The prophet of God. St. John the Baptist, right? The last and greatest of the Old Testament prophets. And so this icon screen that we have, these icons, what it's saying is, this is the eternal King of Judah, the true King of Judah. This is the true Davidic king. This is the king that God promised to David he would establish forever, right? It's not just because we like them and they were the greatest, right, humans after Christ, but it's because specifically this message of this is the Messiah, the Davidic king that God promised. Yeah.
Do you know what the book, the Bible said?
What is the book of on this I can't say in this particular one, it's not clear enough, but it depends on the icon. I don't know, Father, if you can read it from there. But,
Not
here, sorry, Father walked in. Hi, Father.
Hi, Father.
he's
The
he's
transfiguration was Moses and Abraham, was that
Moses and Elijah.
Elijah?
I mentioned that.
And that's also prophets, right?
They are, and particular prophets for a reason.
Okay.
Sorry, Father, can you?
No, it's a little blurry.
Okay,
Yeah,
it's
but
too blurry,
can you
but-
get?
Fine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's Moses and Elijah because they're the two prophets who did what?
Met God on the mountain.
Met God on the mountain. They saw God, right? Maybe not face to face, maybe the back. It says
Right.
Moses spoke to him face to face, right? He's on the mountain. They are on the mountain, rather, with Christ in order to testify, this is the Yahweh I saw. This is Yahweh whom I spoke to on Sinai, right? Because in the Old Testament it says that that the testimony of two witnesses is enough to establish a fact, right? And establish something is true. And so Christ calls forth two witnesses, the two Old Testament prophets who saw him, right? To say this is the Yahweh that we saw.
Okay.
Yeah. And we're going to get into that a little bit more next time. Yeah.
I was just gonna say, when you think about the disciples arguing about who's gonna sit on your right hand or your left,
Right.
like,
Seats taken. Seats taken. Exactly.
it doesn't just become like egotism or, guys, this isn't what we're talking about right now.
Right.
It's like,
Who do you think you are? You're
Yeah,
the
yeah.
king's mom and prophet? No, you'll reign with him. You'll sit on 12 thrones ruling the 12 tribes of Israel, but you're not going to have the right and the left hand, right? Those are taken. Exactly. No, that's a great connection. That's exactly right. Yeah, they're missing the whole point of what's going on. Any other questions or thoughts? Where we'll go from here is, because we've just completed, right, we said there were the 5 people in the Old Testament that were going to be our major benchmarks for the covenants and organize that disorganized closet of materials, right? We said it was Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, and David. So we've completed our 5 people in the Old Testament. Next time, I told you there was a 6th person in the Old Testament we needed to talk about, right? Who's the 6th person in the Old Testament we need to talk about in order to understand what's going on there?
Isaiah.
I'll give you a hint. He's on the screen right now.
Jesus.
Jesus Christ. So,
Oh, yeah.
yeah, him. Right? The one all those prophets in the
Yeah.
law spoke about, right? And so next time we'll talk a little bit about Christ in the Old Testament, how we see him, not just prophesied. I said in particular that he is a person in the Old Testament, not just that he's a person spoken about in the Old Testament, right? So we'll talk about Christ in the Old Testament, and then the time after that we'll talk about the New Covenant and what's going on with Christ himself in the New Covenant, and frankly what's happening with us, right? And then that will have completed our overall organization of our biblical messy drawer. And then we'll begin, as we talked about, going through each book and just one by one talking about what's going on in those books a little bit more. Kind of, we've been at this level, and now we're going to start zooming in a little bit more, and then we'll zoom in a little bit more after that. Okay.
Sounds good.
All right. If there's no other questions, Father, could we ask you to lead us in a closing prayer?
Sure. I'm gonna be here all night.
Yeah.
The Virgin Holy Father, Lord Jesus Christ, our God, have mercy on us and save us.
Amen.
Bless you.
Thank you.
Thank you.